Hey everybody, my name is Yordan. Like Alex said, I'm a 3D artist working at Chaos. I'm responsible for quite a lot of the tutorials that you can find on our YouTube page, some of the release videos, webinars, etc. I also talk with a lot of clients, conduct trainings, and generally help artists use V-Ray to its fullest. So in today's talk, we're going to cover some topics regarding the new features of V-Ray and how can they assist you with product design or even creating final renders and throughout the design process. We're also going to cover some features that are more common and are used in other sections as well, like architectural visualizations or just general 3D work. And then we're going to have a quick Q&A session where I will answer as much of your questions as possible. So let's go. V-Ray 6 for Rhino. So for a long time, V-Ray was focused on developing speed improvements and just rendering faster and faster. But in the last few years, we figure out that helping the user actually set up their render in a more efficient way would be a lot more beneficial than just shortening the render time. So we focused the improvements in a few different aspects. We have created a ton of lighting improvements, helping people set up their scenes a lot more quicker and a lot more efficient. We've added a ton of shading improvements, making it easier to create realistic shaders and realistic objects. And then we've added improvements into the V-Ray frame buffer. With version 5, we've introduced the new version of the VFB2, where we have made it possible to do all of your compositing and color corrections. And with V-Ray 6, we've added a few additional features that I like to talk about. And last but not least, we're going to quickly glance over how we are building an ecosystem to help the whole design process from starting the idea all the way to creating your final visualizations. So let's start right away with creating lighting and how lighting has been improved. One of the most noteworthy features, in my opinion, has been the finite dome. And as you know, when you're creating a dome light, usually this is a infinitely large sphere which casts light onto your objects. And even though it brings realistic reflections, it usually doesn't look so good in the background. So if we take a look at that example, I can quickly add an environment using an HDRI. But as you can see, it doesn't quite match what's going on in my scene. And this is because we are mapping the environment to an infinitely large sphere. But with just a few tweaks when enabling the finite dome, we can actually set a specific size for that dome and make the environment fit a lot more into the perspective of our image. That way, we can easily place our objects and make them feel in a believable way that they're fitting in their environments. And again, once we go into the camera, we can make use of other options. Like, for example, the depth of field will be calculated accurately, and even the environment that's being raycast from the dome light will be blurred out correctly instead of being regarded as an object that's infinitely far away. Next, one of the next features that I want to talk about is the V-Ray Enmesh, which is a very efficient way to create complex geometric patterns over your surfaces. That way you can easily create panels, fences, fabrics, and more in an automated and a very memory efficient way. So let's take a look at the example of our little speaker. I'll use a geometric pattern that I've already created to make the mesh on the speakers. So I just need to select the base mesh, which represents the the overall shape of the speaker. And once I apply Enmesh using the pattern that I've already made from a little bit of geometry, we can see that it immediately is represented in the render. So this is something that's done in render time, so it's not taking any toll on your viewport performance. And because it is based on the UVs of the object, you can very easily control things like tiling, spacing, and on top of that, switch between different depths. So for example, once I've tweaked the tiling, you can see that the whole mesh seems a little bit rough. And that is simply because the height is a little bit too big, but we can tweak that with the height percentage. And that way we can easily represent things like fabrics or any kind of paneling in a very efficient way. Of course, if you're if you're in a hurry and you can't really create your own patterns, you can just turn to Chaos Cosmos and find one of the many presets that we've prepared in there and apply it directly into your objects, tweak it as you wish, and you're good to go from here. The next big thing I want to talk about is V-Ray decal. V-Ray decal has been a very requested feature, and it's been available since V-Ray 6. It gives you the ability to stamp on materials directly on your objects using a gizmo, and that way you can easily add stickers, labels, and generally edit the surface of your objects. And with update 2, we have implemented the cylindrical projection, so that way you can project labels even on things like bottles, cups, or jars. So let's take a look at some of the other improvements that we have. Like I said, we've added the cylindrical decal. So that way, when you're projecting something, onto a surface, you can easily map it so that it fits the size of the decal, and after that fix the projection so that it's not straight on, but it is actually a circular projection, and the decal fits snugly onto the surface. Next thing, and this is a big feature, this is a big thing, we have added decal displacement. So right now, the material that you're applying using V-Ray decal actually can have displacement, and you can generate actual geometry using the decal. And this can come in handy in pretty much any aspect when you're trying to quickly add details to your models, environment, surfaces, etc. So right now we have our decal applied, and we can quickly enable this displacement. And as you can see, immediately we get the effect of additional geometry being generated in render time and giving us additional detail that we don't really need to model. And that way you can quickly iterate through different designs and different shapes for your objects just by switching out decals. Of course, on top of displacement, in the process of adding stickers or anything painted on top of your objects, usually you can have the material that's underneath the decal show through the actual material of the decal. So that way you can take the bump from the base material and actually make it come through the material of the decal. That way you can have a more unified look if that's what you're going for, and you can make your decals blend with your hero object a lot better. The next thing I want to talk about is Chaos Scatter. So Scatter is a very efficient way to distribute objects over a surface or a spline or a volume. And the cool thing is that it's very memory efficient and it renders out very quickly. So you can create huge scenes without sacrificing any kind of memory or detail. So one of the improvements that we've added in version 6 is the slope limitation. So, for example, if you have a geometry that is that has variation in its angle, in its normals, you can easily adjust the spread of the scattering depending on where the surface is pointing at. You can also use different objects to limit the surface that you're scattering to. So, for example, we're using an additional geometry to add a scattering modifier, a surface modifier, and that way you can very quickly dictate where you get your scattering, or in this case, you can switch it to, instead of scatter only on the surface that you've selected, to scatter on the to exclude that surface. In addition to that, we've made it possible that you scatter along the length of a spline, so you can easily create patterns that are following a curved geometry. So things like scattering lamps across a road, or in this case, across a grass field, becomes increasingly easy. So you can very simply just pick your spline and scatter objects along it. The same goes with scattering light objects, which is again an addition with VRA6. And last but not least is the ability to scatter inside the volume of a bounding box for an object. Now, keep in mind this isn't a custom volume for now. It's just using the bounding box for the scattering object, and that way you can easily get any kind of geometry and distribute it inside the volume of your of the bounding box. Next thing I want to cover, this is going more into the shading improvements, is the ACEScg color space. So what exactly is a color space? Basically, like, when you're rendering something, your computer sees it in one way, but in order to represent it on your monitor, it needs to go through a function which changes the colors a little bit so that they're much closer to how we see it in real life rather than how the computer understands it. And the bonus of ACEScg color space is that it can take information from basically any source, like, for example, a camera, and from a render, and unify the colors from those different sources into one. So if you're doing any kind of product renderings where you're mixing your CGI product with an actual environment shot where you've filmed something on set, you can very easily mix the two footages using the ACEScg color space. And there are a few additional advantages in the sense that the ACEScg color space has a much higher dynamic range. So if you take a look at the comparison, you can see that in places like the highlights, you're getting a lot less burned out colors. And again, in places where there is high contrast, you can see that there really isn't any hue and saturation shift that you would get when you're rendering in sRGB color space. The next thing I want to cover is the VFB improvements. We've added a few features that become very handy. We can change background colors. We can organize the layers that we've added while we're compositing in the VFB. And another option which comes with the lens effects is adding chromatic aberration. So let's take a look. like I said, we can use a color, a solid color instead of a background image to adjust our renders. We can take all of the color corrections that we've done and organize them inside different folders so that we can quickly create variations and iterate through them in just a second, or control the complete effect of those color corrections. And last but not least, like I said, we've added the chromatic aberration effect. In photography, usually this is an effect that is caused from the, excuse me, just a second. In photography, usually this is an effect, come on. Okay, in photography, usually this is an effect that is caused directly from imperfections in the lens of your camera. But when you're rendering things, there are no such things as imperfections. So we need to simulate them additionally. And this is where adding something like chromatic aberration can really make your render look just slightly a bit more photorealistic. Okay, on top of that, to help 3D artists make better images, we've added the ability to add guidelines or composition guides directly inside of the V-Ray frame buffer. That way you can easily experiment and enhance your image composition. So the process is fairly easy. Directly in the VFB, you can add another layer called proportion guides. And here you can control things like their color, width, etc., to make it more visible or to make it more suitable to your workflow. And of course, there are different types of proportion guides. You can use diagonals, golden ratios, a central composition, or you can create a custom grid using the custom grid options. Here you can tweak things like the number of rows or the number of columns to create any kind of custom composition that you're looking for. And you can orient your image along the lines of your composition guides. Okay, moving on to a few features that come in handy more in traditional architectural visualizations rather than in product design. And the number one is the procedural clouds. So right now you can add, instead of using an HDRI and trying to figure out which HDRI works best for your image, you can actually create your very own using just the V-Ray sky and sun system by adding our procedural clouds to them. So the process is fairly easy. From the sun and sky parameters, just enable them, and you can play with things like density, variety, add different layers of clouds, and create any kind of sky that you're looking for. On top of that, it becomes very easy to drive the offset of those clouds and animate them. And like I said, the cool thing is that this is a procedural way of working, so that any changes that you make can be tweaked at any time in case your client has any problems with it or wants something different, or in case you want to do something different with your image. The next thing I want to talk about is the V-Ray distance texture. This is an effect that has been in V-Ray for quite a while, but it has just now arrived in V-Ray for Rhino, and it gives you the effect to drive a texture depending on the distance between two objects. That way you can do a lot of things like scatter fur just around a particular object, create grass fields, and drive where the grass is placed depending on the distance texture, and a lot more. So let's take a look at an example. In here, we have our grass created using fur. And what we're going to do is drive its length with a distance texture and its density with a distance texture. And that way, we will make the grass appear longer around the scattered rocks, and much shorter and much less dense, and much less dense in where the pathway is. So that was a quick representation of what the distance texture looked, and as you saw, the black represents the furthest points from our distance texture, and white means it's closer to the object that we're using to drive the distance texture. So that way you can easily create effects just like this one without having to do any kind of custom modeling or adding additional geometries just for the scattering, etc. The next enhancement we've added is V-Ray dirt enhancements. So with that, we can place dirt precisely by adding or excluding objects that affect the V-Ray dirt texture. So as you know, the V-Ray dirt texture is based on ambient occlusion, which means it will appear where there is a occluded section. So in crevices, angles, etc., it will show up as black. And right now, with previous version, it was being affected by all of the objects, but right now you can drive exactly which objects affect the V-Ray dirt. A few other improvements that we've added are improved translucency, thin film layer. We've added the car paint shaders. We've improved the GTR energy preservation. So if you're having a material that is very rough, so the glossiness is very low, you will get an accurate representation of its color. We've optimized animation exports, resumable rendering. We've added masking for lens effects. And now using light mix, you can actually control V-Ray light materials on top of the V-Ray light objects. And like I said, we've tried to help artists along the whole process from the start of the project all the way to creating the high-end visuals. So we've put a lot of effort in building an ecosystem that can empower artists to do their best. The first thing that I want to cover is the Enmesh compatibility. So as you know, Enmesh and Chaos are now one single company, and we've tried to merge best of both worlds. So we've taken the real-time rendering from Enmesh and made sure that everything that is done in the real-time engine can be later on moved to V-Ray and rendered using ray tracing technology, so that you can both preserve the designer ideas, so the designer decisions that were made, and build on top of them and render them in a realistic manner, rather than starting from scratch once your project hits the production rendering phase. So pretty much everything that happens in Enmesh is supported in V-Ray also. So for example, if you build a scene in Enmesh, apply its materials, scatter objects, etc., you can directly switch into V-Ray and render that using V-Ray's render engine. Like I said, all of the objects are transferred, all of the materials are transferred, so you can easily take any material and tweak it on top of what it was done so far. You can edit things like its colors, reflections, bump normal maps, change them, and just make sure to have a to push the rendering to a more realistic result. So all you need to do is just select the material, say that you edit it in V-Ray, and you get a V-Ray material that represents what's happening in landscape, and you're able to edit it quickly and efficiently. The next thing we're adding is the Chaos Vantage Live Link. So now you can navigate your most complicated scenes in a pure ray traced real-time manner without any setup. So basically, you can explore your models and look at their true materials and lighting, and easily output animations and images in a matter of seconds. Excuse me. So you can take any scene from Rhino, no matter how complex it is, and load it inside of Chaos Vantage, where you get a real-time ray tracing preview. And as you saw, switching throughout the different angles, Chaos Vantage was even a little bit faster than the Rhino viewport, making it a very handy tool when you're designing and you want a viewport companion for extremely heavy scenes where where you want to be able to preview everything in real time, set up cameras, change materials, and have instant feedback on what is going on. Excuse me, just a second. The next thing we've done to unify the workflow with V-Ray is take the material library from V-Ray, which if you've used V-Ray 4 and previous versions, you already know, and migrated it into Chaos Cosmos, so you can conveniently find and manage all of your assets in a single location. On top of that, we are working towards enabling the user take advantage of Chaos Cosmos and save their own assets and use the Chaos Cosmos browser to navigate their own library, and not only the library of Chaos. We've taken all of the HDRIs that come with V-Ray's light gen and also added them into Cosmos so that you can do all of the light experimenting on your own and have a much more vast variety of HDRIs to pick from when browsing Chaos Cosmos. The next thing, which is very handy in production rendering, in creating very realistic visuals and product rendering, is Chaos Scans. So if you haven't used them, those are pre-made materials that are scanned from real-life samples. They come as a plug-and-play asset that you can easily edit, change things like material, change things like the material color, or its displacement, or its things like, for example, reflectivity, or add a clear code to it. And it's rendered directly into V-Ray. Like I said, it's just a plug and play. It's a plug and play type of deal. And here are a few examples of scanned materials. As you can see, you can capture the realism of pretty much any fabric with all its intricacies, with its specific anisotropy, reflections, highlights, etc. But this goes on to different materials like leather. Like I said, we have a very unique way of scanning the surface so that we take all of the information from the model, from the sample that we have, and directly feed it into V-Ray. And here is probably the most cool example, in my opinion. So this doesn't work only with standard shaders, with standard surfaces. you can actually have holographic surfaces that have very complex shading. It have very complex shading, like for example the special coding on BIOS or anything that is translucent and has a holographic property to it. The next one is the Chaos Cloud. As you know, it's a cloud rendering solution which is directly integrated into V-Ray. And the cool thing is that it works with just the push of one button. There's no need to set things up. There's no need to figure out or configure any kind of hardware or additional software. Excuse me just a second. So like I said, there's no need to configure any additional software or hardware, just directly inside of V-Ray, click and you will get a render. Of course, you need to set up some settings at first, things like resolution, render settings, choose whether you want to use CPU or GPU, and then just send it to the cloud, where you can do some organizing, change a few settings like the resolution if you need to or if you had forgotten. And from there, you will get a huge amount of CPUs just rendering just for you. And you can get a pristine render fairly quickly, especially when you're trying to render out an animation, because you can render out up to 100 frames simultaneously. Of course, Chaos Cloud allows you to collaborate with your colleagues, so you can share your work and ask for things like feedback or guidance, or you can give feedback to the renders of your colleagues, add different versions of the same render, and comment on those. So everything is fairly easy. Instead of going into the rendering section, you can go into the collaboration section and upload an image. In this case, I'll use one of the renders from our speaker. And here you can easily add comments and suggestions for the 3D artist to change or to improve onto the rendering. And of course, they can give feedback, resolve the issues, and you can send your comments to anyone who might want to see them or make use of them. And with that, we can go into a Q&A session. I've covered most of the things that I wanted to talk about. So if you guys have any questions, I'd be really happy to answer them.
Lovely. All right, I'll just jump in there quickly as well. Thank you for all of that. This is the time to ask your questions. You've got a chaos expert right here, right now, so this is a good opportunity to drop anything in there. I've got a few already, Yordan, so is it all right if I just fire them your way?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, so can we use Chaos Cosmos with our own assets? I think you touched on that one briefly anyway.
Oh, yeah. At the moment, as it is, no, but we're working towards creating it to be more user-friendly so that you'll be able to save your own different materials or objects that you've made, your own different assets, and browse them inside of Chaos Cosmos. And keep in mind, this is not sharing them with anybody else. The library that you create will be your own, completely your own, while still having access to the Chaos Cosmos library, but you'll just be using the Chaos Cosmos browser to reach them.
Okay, cool. Another one. You had the procedural clouds. Are the procedural clouds real volumetrics?
Kind of, and at the same time, they're not. As in, they're rendered as volumetrics will be rendered, but they're not present in your scene, so you can't really go into the sky with your camera and reach the clouds and see them and make a fly through, for example. But the way that they're being calculated is just like a volumetric will be rendered, but of course there are some speed improvements so that they don't hinder the rendering speed of the whole image.
Okay. Another one would be, why use ACEScg instead of a filmic tone map?
Oh, so that's very interesting. Usually filmic works for all of your images, and my opinion is that you should use a color management system that works best for you and you like the most, you like the results of the most. But in case you're having a larger production and you're creating, let's say, product images that involve combining footage from a lot of different sources. So, for example, you have your product rendered with an alpha, and you have some footage made with a camera that you need to incorporate inside of the render. The ACEScg space comes in very handy because it can unify the colors coming from different sources so that they look more uniform in the final composition.
Okay, all right, thank you. There's another one here. It's quite interesting for us actually to know the answer to this one. So is it a straightforward one? Is V-Ray compatible with macOS and M1? And indeed M2, I guess.
Okay, so yeah, that's quite an important question. Of course, V-Ray supports macOS. You can install it, you can render, and Macs use AMD CPU, so V-Ray CPU supports completely that. Regarding the M1 and M2 GPU chips, at the moment, V-Ray GPU doesn't work with them, and as far as I know, supporting them would be quite a big of a hassle. So yeah, you can use V-Ray with your Mac, but you can't utilize the M1 or M2 chips for now.
Okay. Here's quite an open-ended one for you. Has anything been improved for Grasshopper?
Oh, lots of things. There's been added a V-Ray timeline, so you can animate things inside of Grasshopper, create animations. So, for example, animate the position of your sun, animate the geometry that you're creating. We've added support for volumetric so that you can render V-Ray fog or aerial perspective inside of Grasshopper. And also the improved scattering that we saw inside of V-Ray for Rhino has been added inside of Grasshopper too.
Okay, lovely, thank you. We've got another one here. Are these improvements, so what you've covered today, are these improvements part of V-Ray 6 or in general, or are they part of Rhino 8 and V-Ray 6?
Okay, so the improvements that I covered are independent of Rhino 8. So it's just a V-Ray thing, and everything that I've covered comes from V-Ray 6 and updates 1 and 2.
Okay, cool. I've got one more. So again, there's a quick opportunity just to chuck some more questions in if you've got them now. But
Sure.
one that I have here is, why use Enmesh instead of creating an array for geometry?
Oh, well, first of all, Enmesh will render a lot faster than creating just geometry. As you know, polygons take up a lot of space. I mean, they can take up a lot of space in terms of memory, make your file size bigger, etc. While Enmesh utilizes the UV space of the object to create a very efficient way of distributing geometry over it. So first of all, it will keep your viewport fairly light because you're not seeing all the geometry in real time in your viewport. And second, it will be very memory efficient because it's instancing just a small piece of geometry that's being tiled rather than having the whole object be modeled out as it should be.
Okay, cool. I think that covers that. So I can't see any more questions at the moment. I think we've probably had a a fair opportunity to get those in. So I think we'll probably wrap it up and leave it there. Thank you again to Yordan for speaking to us today and sharing your knowledge with us. Is there anything that you want to add before we close, Yordan?
Oh yeah, it was a pleasure doing this, and I hope we do it again soon.
Yeah, we'd be happy to. So as I said at the top of this, we'll send a link of the recording once we're finished, so you can share that around if you want to or catch up. If you've got any further questions, please do feel free to send them over to us at contact@cadsoftwaredirect.com. So yeah, thanks again, Yordan. Thanks to everyone who joined us today. I think we'll leave it there. So enjoy the rest of your day.